you've clearly had a very impressive career, but before becoming one of the top...
That's not what my mother says.
Before becoming one of the top venture capitalists in the world, being knighted by the Queen, you were a boy from Wales. What did you want to be when you grew up?
I actually, not that this game or sport is played in America, and so it won't translate. I wanted to be a cricket player, a cricketer. But I was a coward, and the ball was very, very hard. And so I spent most of my time in sport, whether it was cricket or rugby, trying to avoid being anywhere near the ball. So I have a friend, actually, who became a spectacular rugby player. He played for Wales, and I told him that the only thing that separated him and me on the rugby field was when he took to the field, he wanted the ball to come in his direction. And I, of course, wanted the reverse. I never wanted to see it come in my direction. So, but as I got a bit older, I became interested in journalism. And when I was at Oxford, I knew that I wanted to be a journalist when I was at Oxford.
So I'm interested in the story of how your family came to Wales. It was quite inspiring. Your parents actually escaped Germany during the Second World War, arrived in Wales as refugees, in the UK as refugees. How did their struggles and their experience shape you early on and sort of what you wanted to do with your life?
Well, they were very lucky. They didn't escape during the Second World War. They escaped beforehand. Not many people escaped Germany during the Second World War. My father left Germany. He was born in Munich and went to Britain when he was a 14-year-old. My mother went on something called the Kindertransport, which was 10,000 kids from Germany, basically, that were rescued and put in with in foster homes, and they then met subsequently in Britain, and after the war, they got married, and those are searing experiences, difficult, and I'm sure there are people here either who have first-hand familial experience of something as disquieting, unsettling, and wrenching as those sorts of experiences, but those are the experiences that come down through generations. My father's father served in the German army during World War I. He was decorated. My father's mother was a nurse in the German army during World War I. And then both of them were killed. They were murdered by the Nazis. And my father died about 15, 16 years ago. My mother, whom I saw last week, is 95 and still vibrant. But those experiences, they color everything. They hang over everything like a dark cloud. It is always the anxiety and the fear of the whole world being ripped out from underneath you, and it colors the way that you live, understandably.
And that drives you today still?
Well, I don't know about that, but it certainly had a profound effect on my parents, and they came to Wales as outsiders, and obviously Britain. I owe everything. My parents owe everything to the fact that Britain opened its borders and allowed them to settle there. But it was not easy. They were in a minority. There weren't exactly. I mean, I was one of. I think 3 Jewish kids at the high school that I went to. So I've always, one always felt an outsider, and the delineation between religions in Britain, which is, 40, 50 years ago, was very, very sharp. And so if you didn't belong to the majority, it was very obvious that you were on the outside. So that's obviously had a huge effect.
Well, you did them very proud. You worked really hard. You would get into Oxford. And I'm sure you had many opportunities professionally in Europe, but you decided to come to the United States. Why the United States?
Well, I didn't have many professional opportunities in Europe because I grew up in the Britain that predated Margaret Thatcher, and those were extremely difficult times in Britain. I mean, obviously Britain's going through its own issues today with Brexit, but the times in the 1970s, people who weren't around, and there's no reason that anyone here should know about it, but it was a strike-ridden country where you never knew whether the electricity was going to work, whether there was going to be a gas strike, whether the railways would run, or whether the newspapers would be delivered because there'd be a wildcat strike. And I wanted to be a journalist, and I wanted to work on Fleet Street, and I wanted to work for the Times or the Daily Telegraph or the Guardian or one of the big broadsheet newspapers that at that point dominated journalism in Britain. But because of union restrictions, the Fleet Street newspapers, the big newspapers, were not permitted to hire anybody straight out of undergrad. You had to go and serve a multi-year apprenticeship on small provincial newspapers. And I had no appetite in doing that. I wanted to work on Fleet Street. I wanted to sort of work in the Premier League, so to speak. And I went to see a gentleman who was the editor of the Daily Telegraph, a fellow he was a Fleet Street legend and a character on whom Evelyn Waugh had based the novel Scoop, which is hilarious if you've never read it. And he said, if I was your age, get out of Britain, go to America. And that was what sent me to America. It was that sort of weird, peculiar encounter. And I often think about that. That's what made me up sticks and leave. I mean, well, you know, I was lucky. I wouldn't have been able to come to America had I not got a scholarship because I didn't have the money and all the rest of it. But I got lucky in that, and I came to America. This is 1976, not knowing where anything would lead, but have obviously stayed here.
Yeah, 40 years, you said. So you started out when you got here as a journalist for Time magazine in San Francisco.
Actually, not in San Francisco, in Detroit of all places.
In Detroit.
Covering the first collapse of the Chrysler automobile company.
And then you made your way to San Francisco to cover technology. And during this time, you got to know Steve Jobs. What do you believe made Jobs such a unique innovator and leader in the time that you spent with him?
So this is a long time ago. This is 1980. And Microsoft was a company that I remember going to an event at Apple, one of these sort of management events, small management events, probably this was 1982 or 83. And Steve had a sort of fireside chat like this, and he asked the guest, a fellow who at that point was a Morgan Stanley analyst called Ben Rosen, who later went on to found a very successful venture capital firm. He said, so Ben, pick the year when you think Microsoft will break the $10 million revenue barrier, right? $10 million, and Ben was scratching his head. So it's a very, very long time ago. But that was the only point I was lamely trying to make. And but I realized I hadn't met anyone like Steve. I'd spent time with a fellow called Lee Iacocca, who was a living legend in American industry at that point and had been the president of the Ford Motor Company and then became the CEO of Chrysler. And Steve was the first person whose salesmanship was on a par with Iacocca's. Iacocca was just mesmerizing character. But he didn't have the product and engineering attributes that Steve had. And obviously there was a difference age of probably 35 years or so. But Steve was a spellbinder. And and obviously, as everybody knows these days, a very difficult and complicated character. But he was an extraordinary, and even though I had all sorts of issues in dealing with him, have nothing but, massive admiration for what it is that he eventually went on and did. And but as I said, it's a long time ago, and I think at that time I probably held a minority opinion of how spectacular an individual he was, because later he was, again, ancient history, he was fired from the company that he founded, which to me always seemed like a real travesty.
So following your time with Time Magazine, you would make the switch to the venture capital industry by joining Sequoia, which is very uncommon. How did that happen?
Well, I'd left Time because while I'd enjoyed 4 years or so as a journalist, I also got frustrated. It was a big company. I was working on the periphery of it, and sort of, for some reason, it always felt I didn't want to be a journalist when I was 30 years old. And I had that as some sort of mental benchmark. Goodness knows where that came from. I think it was largely because, again, back then, I saw what happened to people. It was eye-opening to me. I saw what happened to people who stayed in journalism and were 60 years old. And certainly if they worked for Time, which was a sort of cushy job, but you got sent all over the world and you wound up as an alcoholic. Which didn't appear to me to be a really beckoning career trajectory. And so I left, and together with somebody else, I started a little company that published newsletters, staged conferences about the technology industry. And so much for my... And that fella stuck with it, and eventually, many years later, no thanks to me, Dow Jones bought that company. And but I always felt it was going to be a small company. And I had, through my work at Time, through my work at this little company, I'd met a lot of people around the technology industry, and had met a lot of people in the venture capital business. Time had run a cover story that I had reported on about the venture industry that had Arthur Rock, who was the original founder of investor in Intel and then of Apple, on the cover. And during the process of that, had met a lot of people in the venture business, and when I came to California, I didn't know anything about Silicon Valley, didn't know anything about the venture industry, and had got interested in it, and made a list of 5 firms where I knew somebody, wrote to them. You wrote to them in those days, you didn't email them, and got interviewed at all, got rejected at 4 of them. Journalist, history major, no experience working in a Silicon Valley company, therefore totally useless. Probably correct on most of those counts. And then Don Valentine, who was the founder of Sequoia, decided that he needed to do something to change Sequoia's image with minority hiring. And so decided to hire a history major. But it was a head scratcher for most of Don's peers in the venture business, wondering why on earth he was wasting his time with somebody like me. And so that's how it happened. It was great good fortune. If Don had said, voted like the others, and I don't know what I'd be doing.
So in the era of the prized engineering degree in Silicon Valley, what value does that broad-based humanities education bring, given that about 50% of last year's incoming class came in with a humanities undergraduate degree. What value does that bring to the technology ecosystem here in Silicon Valley? What do you think?
Well, I obviously have a prejudice and bias. And knowing full well that I wish I understood more about the details of technology and engineering and all the rest of it. But if you're in the investing business in Silicon Valley, you cover such a wide waterfront of investing that it's very difficult. You can't be, no matter how numerate and technical you are, you cannot be an expert in everything. So the ability to be able to, and this is much like being a journalist, to start on an endeavor where you know nothing, where you gather a lot of materials and facts, where you have to distill all of those facts, and then form a cogent opinion and make a decision. It's not unlike writing a story, writing a history essay, or making an investment, or helping to determine an investment. What comes after that, after making the investment, all the sorts of things that these days go towards helping a little company that might be composed of 3 people becoming something significant, that's a very different set of skills, which I think just experience brings along. It doesn't matter whether or not you have a technical degree or anything. And then the ability to be a storyteller and a clear communicator. I think those are really very, very helpful pursuits. But again, as I said, I have a bias and prejudice, and I was looking at the numbers, at Stanford, for example, you had 600, if I've got the numbers right, which is roughly right, you had 647 undergrads in 1965 who were history majors. In 2014, which was the last set of data that I saw, you had 84. So they're a threatened species around here.
Well, I think you put those skills to good use at Sequoia, given that it's consistently listed as one of the top venture capital firms. And I have to get this statistic right because it kind of blew my mind when I first saw it. So since 1972, Sequoia has backed companies that now have an aggregate public market value of over $3.3 trillion. To put that in relative size, that's larger than the current GDP of the UK. What are the most... Nice work. So,
Put down.
So what do you think are the most important leadership traits needed to build enduring organizations such as Sequoia?
Well, that's nice of you to say. Obviously, that's a question that's at the heart of our pursuit as Sequoia, and also at the heart of the pursuit of the very distinctive companies that we would like to be an investor with. And being able to think and work in 20-year increments is such an advantage. And I know that sounds a little weird and a little peculiar, and obviously you can talk in a grand fashion about a 20-year plan. And it all sounds very good, but then you also have to work on what this afternoon brings. But having a sense of eventually where your compass is heading and where it's set and the trajectory you want to go on, and then breaking it down into all sorts of little steps, knowing that every step along the journey is going to require different people, different skills, different relationships, different virtues, that you're constantly going to have to change along the course and reacting to changing circumstances, changing market conditions, and all the rest of it, but never losing sight of eventually where you want to go. I think that's the biggest thing that that has helped with us and helped with some of these companies that we've had the good fortune to be involved with. Now, obviously, not everything works out like that. A lot of companies start and maybe they flourish for a certain period of time and then they're sold, But the ones that we're looking for, I mean, it's now, where are we? 2019, it's 20 years since we invested in Google, right? I still own the majority of my Google shares. And when somebody asks me today, why are you interested why is Sequoia interested in investing in our company? I'll always say to them, if I think it happens to be true in their particular regard, because some companies don't fit into that, it's because if we're all fortunate, if the sun shines on us, we can be shareholders in your company 20 years from now. That's what today, Airbnb, I think we invested in Airbnb $600,000 in 2008, I think, it may be 2009. It's 10 years. Happens like that. And the company's still private. Stripe, which is a payment services company, we invested in when it was 3 or 4 people. That was 2010. Again, 9 years later. These are very, very long journeys that we're on. And it takes time and patience and spectacular people and a massive market opportunity to build the real companies that matter and have an influence and great impact on society.
And you and Sir Alex talk about the importance of identifying high potential talent in building these types of organizations. So the example he used is a footballer some of you may know by the name of David Beckham, who was pretty good. What characteristics are you looking for when trying to identify this high potential talent, whether it be a founder or somebody you hire at Sequoia?
You know, whether it's part of the reason the reason that I approached Alex to write the book about Manchester United was that for whatever perverse reason, people have been asking me to write a book about Silicon Valley or Sequoia, and I had no interest in doing that, but I was interested in writing about enduring organizations. And I picked United because it was a long way away from Silicon Valley, but because I knew that he shared the approach that we cherished as well. One of which, Patrick, was the one that you just fingered, which was identifying people when they are young and then helping them develop. And why? Part of it is because you're not taking a lot of risk. Beckham, I think, you know, they knew about Beckham when Beckham was 8 years old at Manchester United. Now, we're not going around Stanford looking for 8-year-olds, but we do like hiring at Sequoia people who are young, because it's a business that, even though it looks simple, and today I understand everybody's an investor, from someone who writes $5,000 checks to somebody who writes a much bigger kind of check, but to do it well in the fashion that we like to do it takes time and patience and persistence and a willingness to learn. And assuming people like that flourish, you have incredible loyalty, and they'll stay with you forever. And so that was true for a lot of the players who played for Sir Alex. And I think being able to grow organically like that, it's such an enormous competitive advantage, where you have a stable team of people, which you're always amending, you're always changing. Someone is perhaps no longer playing as well as they used to play, so you figure out a way to deal with that. But then you're always replenishing the bench, but you're doing it in an imperceptible fashion to people on the outside, so that all they see is, you know, in the soccer metaphor, the winning team on the field, without realizing that actually, you know, there are 2 players on there today who weren't on that team 24 months ago. But that's worked spectacularly for us. We've got these great, Roloff Boto, who's a graduate of GSB, and he went to PayPal, and after PayPal, he joined Sequoia. And that was probably now 17, 18 years ago. And, you know, he's just spectacular. He's just one example. We've got a whole bunch of other people like that, so it's great.
one of the characteristics you mentioned that I was really intrigued by is this idea of obsession. So the best founders, the best athletes tend to be obsessed with whatever it is, the thing that they're working on. I was curious, what do you think obsession means to you, and how does it feel? Like, how do you know it when you see it?
There's a gentleman called Apurva Mehta, who's the founder and CEO of Instacart, the online grocery company. And we've been with Apurva on his journey for a considerable period of time now. And before we invested, I asked him how he had happened on grocery delivery as a business that he wanted to be in. And he said he'd played around with and toyed with a variety of other businesses that he wanted to start. And he'd got down the road on, I forget, 2, 3, 4 of those. But he said the only one, or he realized Instacart was the one for him when it was the idea of the business was the last thing that he thought about when he went to sleep and the first thing that he thought about when he woke up in the morning. And to me, that was as good a definition of obsession as any I've heard. But it's that sort of full-on experience that you can never stop thinking about and you don't switch off. I'll give you another example from yesteryear, which was, again, this is back to the early 1980s, and I had been up in Seattle working on a story about Microsoft for Time. And again, this was when Microsoft was still private and it was still quite small. And Bill Gates gave me a ride to the airport in his car. And not many people can say that they were chauffeured by Bill Gates. In fact, I may put that on my LinkedIn profile above all other forms of education. And the radio was missing in the car. Big gaping hole in the dashboard. And I said, Bill, so what happened here? Did you get ripped off? And he said, no, I had it taken out. Why did you have it taken out? Well, I drive from my home to the office, which is 7 minutes and 32 seconds, and then I'll drive from the office to the airport, which is however long. And he said, if I've got the radio, I'm afraid that I'll switch it on, and I won't be thinking about Microsoft. That's obsession.
I believe you. So the funding environment right now, as you alluded to, is becoming extremely competitive. There are a record number of firms.
I didn't allude to it. You alluded to it.
True. There are a record number of new venture firms and capital in the market. SoftBank just raised a $100 billion vision fund. Sequoia just raised an $8 billion fund. Are there too many investment dollars chasing too few investable opportunities right now?
So that's the line I've heard since 1986, with 1 or 2 exceptions, maybe 1991, 1992, and then right after the dot-com blow-up, when everybody understood that capital was scarce. It's always been a competitive funding environment. There've always been, look, how many companies get financed, and then how many become become tremendously important companies. So if you just do that winnowing and look at the funnel, there are very, very few great companies. So everybody is madly in pursuit of those companies, and therefore, and obviously there are these tangible examples of the enormous value that's being created in the world of technology in the last 30 or 40 years. And so money has poured into the sector. But for us, it's always been this sort of almost always been this sort of environment where a really spectacular idea can get raise capital, where somebody who's starting a company usually has choices of capital. I mean, that's the world that I grew up in. It's the world that we've always operated in, and I suspect it'll be the world we always operate in. And it's just part of life in our business.
So no bubble. You're good.
Well, there are always, look, there are always things that we will have done, others will have done, that 5, 10 years from now we'll say to ourselves, how did we ever do something as silly as that? Or wasn't it inane or crazy? Or we didn't anticipate this, that, or the other. So I'm sure we'll have egg on our face from time to time. Again, it's just an occupational hazard.
So I want to talk a little bit about how Silicon Valley has changed. There continues to be many discussions happening about how to make both technology companies and venture capital more diverse, potentially beyond history majors. What responsibility does the venture industry have to fostering diversity in the technology ecosystem?
The responsibility of the Valley of firms like ours is to identify burgeoning talent. And the more the merrier, from irrespective of gender, irrespective of background, irrespective of color. Now, that's easy to say, and it's a bland statement, and you will then rightly say, well, what are you doing about it, and what are you doing about it actively? So we're doing what we can, but there's only so much that we can do. Firms like ours are representative of social trends, and I sort of sense that this question might come up. So I'd turn the question around, because I dug up the data on diversity at Stanford in majors, and it's shocking. So let me give you some statistics. So, because I think this whole issue is one that all of us have something to do about. So, and I'll give you one little example, say from the math department in the undergraduate program here. And this is germane. I have a friend of mine whose daughter is in the math department at the moment and is thinking about leaving the math department and switching to another major because she is surrounded by men. And so in 1983, if you were an undergraduate at Stanford, there was only 22% of the students who had elected math as their major were women. Guess what that number was in 2014, which is the last year when data was available? 22% in 1983, 16% in 2014. If you're a computer science graduate at Stanford, the percentage of women in the class in 1983 was 21%. In 2014, 20%. And the only point I'm making is we'll hire as quickly and as merrily as we possibly can. We have 7 female investment partners today. We've got, I think, close to half a dozen female CEOs that we've backed. But we're a reflection of society, and we can only change as fast as the rest of society will change. But we're more than happy to do our part. We funded all these different initiatives to help women in particular in technology. We have one of our partners, Jess Lee, is working with something called Female Founders. But it's imperative for the high schools and for the universities of America to change before we'll see the real acceleration in technology, which I've got to say is a lot better today than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And I think, if you look at the computer science numbers, those are the best numbers that I could find at Stanford. But even so, they're not overwhelming. In 1983, the computer science proportion of the computer science class here, undergrad, was 18%. It progressed, but in 2014, it was still only 28%. So there's tons of work for all of us to do. That's my only point.
So I want to take our discussion beyond the Valley, because investing outside of Silicon Valley has become a very popular topic as well for a lot of people, including Sequoia. Do you think this is still the best place in the world to start a company?
It's here and it's in China. And there are trials and tribulations involved with both places. And obviously everybody knows about how expensive it is and the cost of living and gross receipts tax in San Francisco and all these other impediments that we wish weren't here. But my goodness gracious me, much as people here will complain and moan about different aspects of Silicon Valley, you go to places elsewhere around the world, they all wish they were Silicon Valley. So it's a spectacular, fantastic place in which to start a company. And then I was saying to your illustrious dean before I came, while we were chatting backstage, that I spent the last 3 weeks traveling in China and Southeast Asia. I mean, those are vibrant places. One of the very big changes, China, obviously, everybody's read about, but Southeast Asia is really pulsing with entrepreneurial activity. And that's a big change in the last 6 years. Everybody knows about India and talked about India, but Southeast Asia is surprisingly vibrant. So there are lots of, the big change from when I started in the venture business a long time ago now, was that Silicon Valley, largely Silicon Valley, to some extent Boston, we had 100% market share, give or take, on the most important technology companies of tomorrow. That's completely changed. So that so much of the investment now occurs outside of the United States for a whole variety of reasons.
So I want to get a little bit of advice before we turn it over to the audience. So I think we're all trying to determine how to focus our time, energy, and resources upon graduation. If you were to put yourself in our shoes today, what problems or industries would you be focusing on? Maybe another way to ask that question is, where is Sequoia going to be investing so we can skate to where the puck's going to be?
Well, that's assuming that we know what we're doing. I've always found, you go to any website, and every investor's website, despite the window dressing, they all look the same, and everybody's going to invest in, whatever the buzz phrases of the era are, you will read them on all the sites. And today it may be data science and machine learning and artificial intelligence and whatever the attributes are. To me, the best investments are always the ones that don't fit in a convenient bucket. And so you think about, I mentioned Airbnb a few minutes ago. You think about Airbnb, what bucket would you have put 3 couch surfers in 2008? And in retrospect, it all looks so obvious. Oh, they're upsetting the hotel industry and all the rest of it. But at the time that we met the company, it was 3 young founders who were sort of sleeping on airbeds. And it was sort of pigeonholed as this very niche service for young people. Who would ever have imagined? And I can point to any number of other investments that seem similar. So to me, it's, years and years ago, Stanford, this was yet another offshoot of the incredible fertile Stanford campus when we invested in Yahoo. The idea of investing in a company that gave its service away for free, this is 1995, was totally foreign, came out of left field. So it's those investments, the ones that aren't the obvious ones, that are the really interesting ones. We invested some years ago in DJI, which is a drone company in China. Nobody had imagined it at the time that we invested it'd do, I think it did, I may be a bit off with the numbers, but $2 billion in sales last year from what seemed like a sort of little, nice little consumer toy at the beginning of the investment, but which is now becoming a company of substance, particularly as it expands into industrial applications. So it's we're not unfortunately, we weren't an early investor in Uber, but who would have, luxury black car executive ride sharing, Is that ever going to become a business? You know, if you switch the clock back 10 years, or whenever Uber got started, it's another one of those sorts of examples. So that's the thing to look out for. It's the unexpected.
I'm going to move to the lightning round. What last chance? Anyone? Okay. So I'll explain the format as we go. These are supposed to be fun. One-word answers generally, but a couple lists. So prioritize the following in order of importance: product, team, market.
Equal weighting.
Unbelievable. It depends. Fill in the blank. The greatest entrepreneur of all time is?
Whoever invented the wheel.
Wow. Talk about yesteryear. The greatest individual investor outside of the Sequoia partnership is?
It's obvious. You know where he is in Omaha.
What is one company you passed on that you wish you had invested in?
I wish it was only one. Uber. We became late-stage investors in the company, but I wish we'd invested very early on.
What percentage of success in VC is luck?
101%.
The most underrated skill in a leader is?
Listening.
I thought you would have said discipline.
What?
I thought you were going to say discipline for sure.
Listening.
That shows. Would you rather beat Liverpool or Benchmark?
We just concentrate on beating them both.
Please join me in thanking Sir Michael Moritz for coming today.
Thanks. Good job.
Thanks so much.